What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a full camera comparison between the new Samsung Galaxy A51 and last year's A50 and A50S devices. Now, if you're looking for a full-on phone comparison, that video is already up on the channel, and I'll leave a link down below to where you can find that. For this video, though, we're strictly going to be focusing on the cameras from these three devices, and I'm going to talk about all the major differences and changes you'll find if you're maybe thinking about upgrading from one phone to another. Obviously, the A51 is the latest device with some significant changes to the camera hardware, but you might be surprised to see that the real-world differences aren't always as drastic as maybe some of us had expected, and I'll get into that in just a second. Before we get started, if you are interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own, or maybe want to learn about any of these phones yourself, I'll have all of them listed and linked down below in the video description at their cheapest current prices, so be sure to check down there. So to start things off, let's talk about the camera hardware and what exactly is different between these three phones. Now, the A50, which came out in March of last year, packs a triple camera setup around back. It includes a 25 megapixel f1.7 aperture main lens, an 8 megapixel ultra wide shooter, and a 5 megapixel depth sensor for getting those live focus shots. And I think given how popular this phone was last year, both here in the US and internationally, a lot of folks are pretty familiar with this phone and the kinds of pictures and videos it's capable of. The A50S, which came out in September, saw some slight upgrades over the A50, mainly for the primary lens. This phone has a 48 megapixel f2.0 primary shooter, an 8 megapixel wide-angle lens, and a 5 megapixel depth sensor as well. This phone also offered 4K video, which the standard A50 did not. Between these two phones, I think you'll find the difference in pictures and videos to be noticeable, but not necessarily significant. But when we get to the side-by-side comparisons, you can decide that for yourself. Last but not least, we have the newest device in the lineup, the A51. This phone has a 4-lens setup, though honestly, there aren't actually too many crazy changes, at least hardware-wise, over the A50S. The main lens is once again a 48 megapixel f2.0 shooter. There's a new, better 12 megapixel ultra-wide lens. The 5 megapixel depth sensor remains the same, and there's an entirely new lens added as well, a macro shooter for super close shots. And that lens is specific to just the A51 device. It's obviously not something either of the previous A50s had. In regards to some other upgrades, I think the biggest thing you'll notice specific to the camera is better video stabilization with the A51, which you'll probably see. But let's also talk about some other factors that will affect the results. In addition to the camera hardware and software, the other contributing factor to better pictures and videos is the actual specs of the device itself. Better specs often lead to better image and video processing. But interestingly enough, in this case, the specs between these phones differ only slightly. Both the A50S and A51 pack the Exynos 9611 chipset, while the standard A50 has the 9610. The GPUs across all three phones are exactly the same, the Mali G72 MP3, and each phone can be configured with either 4 gigs or 6 gigs of RAM. I think right away, the most telling thing about these phones is the hardware specs that you're getting. Specifically with these A-series phones at least, the internal specs aren't all that different from one device to another. And even the lenses and actual camera hardware don't vary much either. And I think that mostly has to do with the fact that these phones weren't released that far apart from one another. From the A50 to the A50S, we're talking barely 7 months or so. And from the A50S to the A51, it's even less time, like 5 months. In that short of a time span, Samsung can't do that much different, I don't think. And in real-world tests, you'll probably find firsthand that the results from these pretty similar phones are pretty similar overall. Also, just to note, on the software side of things, there isn't much difference here either. There aren't any new features or capabilities, at least anything useful. AR doodles I don't consider to be useful. And you'll see that while the options are placed a little different because of the different Android versions, most everything is exactly the same. There's the same live focus, night mode, pro settings, wide angle, super slow-mo. Everything is pretty much identical. And aside from the 4K shooting mode on the A50S and A51, there isn't much on the software side that really differentiates things here. So enough talking, let's dive into some real world examples. I'm going to talk about a couple of these and then I'll let the video play out a bit so you can analyze them for yourself. But with this first picture here, and really through most of these samples, I noticed just a couple consistent things. First off, dynamic range is better overall on both the A50S and A51 when compared to the standard A50. I think each picture has comparable detail, but again, I might favor the A50S and A51 equally over the A50. What's probably most obvious is that color and saturation. Interestingly enough, at least here with this shot, the A50S seems to be the most vibrant, perhaps even a little bit oversaturated, while the A50 comes out a bit dull. This picture was taken with just the standard lens, of course, and like I said earlier, honestly, the difference isn't as drastic as maybe I had hoped. This picture here is even closer. Aside from the sky, I can hardly see much that really separates these three pictures. Colors look nearly identical, the exposure is even across the board, and the detail is pretty comparable, whether you're looking at the grass up close or the trees towards the back. Just a really surprising result here for sure. Now, there are some instances where the difference is much more obvious, like this shot for example. When the scene is a little dimmer, the A50 tends to overbrighten and overexpose while losing a bit of detail, and you can see that the A50S and A51 handled things a bit better. It's more natural, more even, and overall I think a better looking shot than what the A50 could produce. The biggest difference I think you'll come across with these three phones is actually with that wide angle lens. I've personally found that the A51 gets the balance right with the color, the exposure, and the detail. The standard A50 overexposes a bit and also really misses those dark shadows, and the A50S falls somewhere in between. And one last point to make, in regards to those front cameras, we're actually seeing some pretty big differences here. The standard A50 has a 25 megapixel f2.0 selfie camera. The A50S gets a bump up to a 30 megapixel f2.0 shooter, and the A51 seemingly has a different 32 megapixel lens with an f2.2 aperture. Now, to be completely honest, I always thought that the front camera on the A50 was not that great. And when stacked up against the A50S and A51, the difference is very obvious. The A51 is certainly the best by a significant margin, in my opinion, especially when it comes to producing a highly detailed image. So if selfies are especially important to you, the A51 is the clear choice by far. So I'm gonna go ahead and let the rest of these pictures and videos play out for you guys to enjoy and compare on your own. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll meet you back up at the end of the video. So here are my final thoughts. While there is sometimes a noticeable difference in image quality between all three of these phones, I was honestly surprised to find out that the difference is pretty insignificant. All in all, honestly, it does sort of make sense. These phones are not even a year apart, and Samsung didn't do that much to differentiate them from one another. Like I said earlier, I found the biggest difference to be from the front selfie camera, not any of the rear lenses. And I don't think that's really something a lot of people are looking at. The bottom line though is this. While you are likely getting a better result with a new A51, I don't know if it's the significantly better picture and video taking device that might warrant an immediate upgrade. For me personally, if I'm strictly looking at image and video quality and nothing else, it's sort of a tough decision to make. And I'd want to consider some other features and upgrades that the A51 might offer over my current phone before I make that purchase decision. But let me know what you guys think. Which phone did you prefer? And do you think the A51 is significantly better at taking pictures and videos? Let me know in the comments down below. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.